I opened the door with a sigh and slipped off my heels. The day had been exhausting. Endless calls, an avalanche of work, and colleagues who all seemed to need something. All I wanted was a hot shower, silence, and a couple of hours to forget the world. But instead, I heard a low male voice coming from the living room. "Margot, you're home." Adam, my husband, peeked out with a broad smile. "I want to introduce you. This is my brother Lucas. He'll be staying with us for a while." I froze for a moment. Lucas. Over 7 years of marriage, we had barely crossed paths. He seemed like a figure from another reality. All I knew was that he was younger than Adam, worked in construction, and their relationship was always tense. But the man standing in front of me wasn't just Adam's brother. He exuded a confidence that felt almost territorial, as if he wasn't here to visit but to claim something. "Nice to meet you," Lucas said, his voice low and calm, almost hypnotic. His handshake lingered a moment too long. His gaze lingered too, and something in his eyes made me feel exposed. "Lucas asked to stay while he sorts out some issues with his apartment," Adam continued, oblivious to my discomfort. "It's temporary." "Of course," I replied with a smile, trying to sound friendly. I went to our bedroom feeling unsettled. It wasn't irritation or anger, more like an inexplicable sense of invasion, though there was no reason for it. His presence had disrupted the normal rhythm of our home. At dinner, I watched Lucas surreptitiously. He was clearly used to attention, speaking confidently with a subtle hint of sarcasm. Even his gestures were deliberate, almost rehearsed. He never addressed me directly, but I caught him watching me. It felt awkward, as if I were standing under a spotlight with him observing every detail of my face and movements. "You were home late," Adam said as we finished eating. "Everything okay?" "Yes, just work," I deflected, standing to clear the dishes. Lucas got up as well and followed me to the sink. "Let me help," he offered, taking a plate from my hands. "No need. You're a guest." I tried to step back, but he didn't budge. "I'm not the kind of guest who just sits around," he said with a small smile, his fingers briefly brushing mine. A trivial gesture, but something tightened inside me. Later that evening, I was tidying the kitchen when he approached again. Adam was busy on a call, leaving us alone. "That dress suits you," Lucas said suddenly, studying me. "It highlights your elegance." I looked at him, startled, unsure how to respond. The compliment sounded innocent, but the tone in which it was delivered hinted at something more. "Thank you," I replied curtly, turning back to the dishes, though my hands trembled slightly. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his gaze on my back. That feeling stayed with me even later as I lay in bed. Sleep wouldn't come. His presence bothered me, not just because of who he was, but because of the ease with which he created an atmosphere that made it hard for me to feel at peace. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a simple compliment, a bit of attention. But deep down, I knew Lucas had brought something else into our home, something I couldn't ignore. The house was quiet early in the morning. Adam was still asleep as I crept downstairs to make coffee. Light seeped through the blinds, painting stripes across the floor. This was my favorite time, the morning calm, when I could focus on myself. But I wasn't alone. Lucas was already sitting at the table, lazily flipping through a magazine. He wore casual shorts and a t-shirt, his relaxed posture making it clear he felt at home. "Morning," he said, glancing up from the pages. His voice was low, still husky from sleep. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound composed. I turned on the coffee maker and grabbed cups, hoping to avoid a conversation, but his presence already disrupted my usual routine. I focused on the coffee, but I could feel him move closer. His tall frame cast a shadow across the counter. "Need help?" he asked. "No thanks, I've got it under control," I said, keeping my tone even. But his proximity made me uncomfortable. When I turned to grab the sugar, his hand brushed against mine. It was a fleeting moment, no more, yet somehow it felt too personal. The warmth of his skin seeped into mine, as if the touch meant more than it should have. "Sorry," he said, pulling his hand back. His voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't quite decipher. "It's fine," I answered quickly, averting my gaze. The rest of the morning passed with mundane tasks, but that brief touch lingered in my thoughts. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But every time he appeared in my line of sight, the memory of that moment returned. When Adam came home, Lucas was as composed as ever, as if nothing had happened. He chatted easily, talked about work, joked. I envied his ease. He seemed like a man untouched by worry. I, on the other hand, was retreating further into myself. At one point, I found myself watching Lucas from the corner of the kitchen, studying his movements, the way he carried himself. It wasn't curiosity. It was something more, something I tried to suppress. That night, lying beside Adam, I kept replaying that morning moment in my mind. Why had a single touch stirred so much in me? Was it a sign I was losing control? Or had I already lost it long ago? Fitness had always been part of my life. I was used to working out at home, where everything was within reach, and there were no prying eyes. A set of dumbbells, a yoga mat. It was all I needed to stay in shape. But when Lucas suggested going to the gym with him, I felt an immediate tension. "Why not try something new?" he remarked casually, leaning back in his chair with a faint smile. "I saw your dumbbells in the corner. I think you'd enjoy a real workout." For a moment, I hesitated. On one hand, the idea seemed unnecessary. I already had my routine. But on the other, refusing Lucas felt awkward. Adam would have definitely encouraged me to go. That thought held me back from declining. "Fine," I said shortly, trying to sound indifferent. "But I don't like crowds." "That's not a problem. I know a quiet spot," he replied confidently. An hour later, I found myself in an unfamiliar gym, surrounded by machines, mirrors, and the faint scent of metal. Lucas looked entirely at ease, as if this was his natural habitat. He moved effortlessly, showing me how to use various equipment. I tried to stay calm, but his enthusiasm was disarming. "Let's try this," he said, pointing to the leg press machine. "It's great for building strength." I sat down, following his instructions, when I suddenly felt his hands on my waist. The touch was unobtrusive, but the sensation of his fingers through the fabric sparked an inexplicable tension in me. "Relax," he said quietly from behind me. His voice was low and gentle, but there was a firmness in it that I couldn't ignore. I took a deep breath and tried to focus on the movement. Yet with each repetition, the awareness of his touch grew stronger. It was ridiculous, just a normal workout, normal guidance, but his touch felt far too personal. By the end of the session, I felt drained, not physically, but emotionally. Lucas seemed completely unfazed, as if nothing that had happened carried any significance. As we walked out, I caught his gaze. There was something too direct in it. "Good job," he said as he got into the driver's seat. "I think you should choose the gym over home workouts more often." "Maybe," I replied, unable to come up with anything more convincing. That evening, I tossed and turned in bed, feeling an unsettling restlessness. The workout should have helped me unwind, but instead, I kept thinking about how his hands had rested on my waist. Why did it bother me so much? I tried to convince myself it was just random moments, that I was overthinking, but every time I closed my eyes, that moment replayed itself. Everything that had happened over the past few days was starting to feel like more than mere coincidences, and that scared me. The day dragged on endlessly. Adam had left for a meeting with colleagues, leaving Lucas and me alone in the house. I tried to keep busy, cleaning, folding laundry, preparing dinner. But his presence, even in another room, was palpable, like a distant hum that couldn't be drowned out. Toward evening, after finishing my chores, I decided to make myself some tea. The kitchen was quiet, the steady hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I stood by the sink, staring out the window, when I heard footsteps behind me. My body tensed before I even turned. "You've had some stressful days," Lucas said softly, stopping nearby. His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of warmth. "Everyone does," I replied curtly, pouring water into the kettle. I tried to maintain an air of calm, but his proximity was unnerving. Lucas didn't leave. Instead, he leaned closer, and I caught a whiff of his cologne. Woody, slightly spicy. It was so close that my breath caught. "You're too tense," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You haven't let yourself relax, not even for a moment." I turned, intending to respond, but didn't get the chance. He stepped forward, and the next thing I knew, his lips were on mine. It was unexpected. Warmth, confidence, insistence. I froze, stunned by his audacity, but a moment later, anger surged through me. My hand reflected that anger. The slap was loud, sharp, and I felt my palm tremble with tension. "What do you think you're doing?" I finally managed, stepping back. Lucas straightened calmly as if he had anticipated my reaction. He looked at me without a hint of shame, his face serene but his gaze too direct. "Do you think I haven't noticed?" he said quietly, firmly. "I've always felt something for you that I shouldn't have, and I know you feel it too." "Shut up," I interrupted, feeling a burning inside me at his words. You've crossed every line." "Maybe," he agreed. "But Margot, I won't lie to myself, and you shouldn't either." He turned and walked away, leaving me in complete turmoil. I stood there in the kitchen, still feeling the imprint of his kiss on my lips, as if it had left a mark I couldn't erase. My thoughts swirled like thick smoke. Should I tell Adam? But what exactly? That his brother had kissed me? And I didn't even know how to describe my feelings. A storm of contradictions consumed me, anger at Lucas, and a vague sense of guilt toward myself and my husband. I took a step toward the kitchen door but stopped. Lucas's words echoed in my mind. He was wrong, but was I sure of what I felt myself? Night fell, but the answers didn't come. The morning began surprisingly quietly. Lucas didn't appear for breakfast, and I felt relieved not to see him. After last night's kiss, I was doing everything I could to avoid crossing paths with him. In the kitchen, at the table, I focused on making sandwiches for Adam, pretending nothing had happened. But fragments of last night kept replaying in my mind. His touch, his words, his gaze. Adam, as usual, was cheerful and focused on work. He didn't seem to notice my tension. Or perhaps he chose to ignore it. I wanted to believe I could forget what had happened. But every time I heard Lucas's footsteps or his voice in another room, my insides churned. Lucas, on the other hand, acted as if nothing had happened. He was calm, friendly, and polite, which only made my unease grow. I avoided looking at him, trying not to be in the same room with him. But his presence still filled the house. His gaze, it wasn't the same as before. It was too direct, too deliberate. That evening during dinner, Adam and I sat at the table discussing his day. I tried to keep the conversation flowing, but my words felt strained, as if I were playing a part in a play. Everything seemed normal until I heard my phone chime. I glanced at the screen and my heart sank. "Margot, I'm sorry for last night. It was wrong. But I can't get you out of my head." A message from Lucas. A wave of warmth and dread swept through me. Adam was watching me. "Is everything okay?" he asked, frowning. "You seem tense." I quickly set the phone aside, trying to compose myself. "Yes, just work stuff," I said, forcing a smile that felt hollow. "You're sure?" Adam's gaze lingered, growing sharper. "If something's wrong, just tell me." "Everything's fine, really," I said, trying to change the subject by asking about his meetings. Adam looked away for a moment, but something in his face told me he didn't believe me. The dinner continued, but the tension in the room grew heavier, like the thick air before a storm. As I cleared the table, the message kept echoing in my mind. Why had Lucas chosen now to write to me? His apology seemed sincere, but the words about not being able to forget me? I hated myself for the way that line lingered in my mind. like the echo of something forbidden but irresistible. Later that evening, I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to Adam in the bathroom brushing his teeth. His actions held nothing new, the same familiar movements, the same ritual that played out day after day. I loved him. This was the man I had shared my life with. So why did the crack between us feel like it was growing wider? Maybe it wasn't about him. Maybe it was me. I lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. In the darkness, I stared at the ceiling, searching for answers. Lucas's message and his gaze kept returning to me, like a whisper I couldn't ignore. The house felt unusually large after Adam left. His business trips were routine, and I was used to them. But this time, something was different. Lucas was here, and his presence filled every corner of the house, even when he was out of sight. I tried to focus on chores, keeping my mind occupied to avoid wandering thoughts. The garage had been my long-ignored project, cluttered with boxes, tools, and forgotten items. I decided that cleaning it would be the perfect way to distract myself. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating the chaos. I rolled up my sleeves and started sorting through the mess, determined to clear some space. But solitude didn't last long. Lucas appeared as if on cue, sensing an opportunity to step in. I heard his footsteps before seeing him in the doorway. He didn't ask for permission, simply grabbed one of the heavier boxes and moved it aside, making my task easier. I didn't resist. At first, his silent assistance felt convenient, but it soon became oppressive. There was something too deliberate, too focused in his every move and glance. I stumbled upon a box filled with old photographs. One photo caught my attention. It was of me, young, standing on a beach, carefree and happy. The image stirred a warmth that quickly gave way to emptiness. When I returned to the present, Lucas was already beside me, looking at the photo over my shoulder. His gaze was heavy, probing, but he said nothing. I tucked the photograph back into the box and resumed sorting through the clutter. Lucas remained close, his silence more intrusive than words. At some point, he moved the boxes nearer to me, forcing us to work side by side. His proximity became unbearable, as if he were trying to communicate something without speaking. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice calm yet insistent. He began talking about how people often lose themselves, sacrificing everything for others. His words pierced deeper than I wanted them to. He spoke of freedom, of remembering one's desires. I tried to block him out, but every gesture, every look he gave me made it clear that his words were meant for me. I felt his hand on mine. The touch wasn't forceful or aggressive, but its significance was undeniable. I froze, then quickly pulled away, stepping back to meet his gaze. In that moment, every instinct screamed at me to leave, to escape, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. I walked out of the garage, leaving him behind amid the dust and forgotten things. Back in my room, I struggled to catch my breath. His words lingered, like drops of water on a smooth surface. He had spoken the truth, but that truth terrified me. Some part of me agreed with him, but I couldn't let it take hold. I woke to the sound of a knock on the door. Warm morning sunlight seeped through the curtains as I lingered in that half-asleep haze. At first, I thought it was Adam, but then I remembered he was away on a business trip. When I opened my eyes, the door was already ajar, and Lucas walked in carrying a tray. On the tray was a cup of coffee, a plate of toast, and a small vase with a single flower. The scene looked like something out of a movie. He set the tray on the bedside table without a word, offering me a faint smile. "You deserve a break," he said, his voice soft, almost tender. I sat up, pulling the blanket closer around me. The gesture might have seemed thoughtful, even sweet, but his motives made me uneasy. A strange mix of gratitude and indignation stirred in my chest. "That's unexpected," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Just think of it as an apology for everything I've said," he replied, giving me a lingering look before turning and leaving the room. I sat there staring at the tray. The breakfast didn't feel innocent. It carried an unspoken weight I was trying to ignore but couldn't. I ate a few bites of toast, but I had no appetite. My thoughts returned to Lucas. His words, his touch. The day passed in a haze of routine, but the tension was palpable. Lucas stayed within sight but didn't intrude. His restraint only heightened the sense of an impending confrontation. In the evening, he approached me unexpectedly while I sat in the living room with a book. "Why don't we go to the lookout point?" he suggested, his voice casual as if it were the most natural idea. "No thanks," I replied quickly without even thinking. "I'm not in the mood." "Margot, it's just a walk." His tone softened but grew more insistent. "You deserve some fresh air." I wanted to refuse again, but something inside me wavered. Maybe it was the desire to end the confusion he had brought into my life once and for all. "Fine," I said shortly, closing my book. The drive was silent. The evening sky darkened gradually, painting everything in soft hues. When we reached the lookout point, the city sprawled below us like a sea of lights. It was beautiful, almost mesmerizing, but the tension between us made it hard to enjoy. "Do you know why I wanted to bring you here?" he asked, staring into the distance. I didn't answer. My fingers gripped the railing tightly as if it could anchor me. "Because I can't ignore this anymore," he continued. His voice was steady, but emotion crept into it. "You're more to me than just my brother's wife. You know that." I struggled to meet his gaze. His face was serious, his eyes piercing. Every word he spoke cut through me, leaving a mark. I knew he was waiting for a response, but the words stuck in my throat. He stepped closer, as if to touch me, but I pulled back. The movement was almost reflexive, but it conveyed everything I couldn't say aloud. "No, Lucas," I finally managed. "This is wrong." He stopped but didn't look away. His eyes were bottomless, filled with emotions I couldn't accept. We stood there for a few moments before I broke eye contact. "We should go back home," I said, my voice trembling. We returned to the car in silence. I didn't look at him, but I could feel his gaze. The drive home was wordless. The evening left a weight on me that I knew wouldn't easily lift. The evening had enveloped the house. I was in the bedroom trying to distract myself with a long-forgotten book. But the words blurred, their meaning slipping away as my thoughts returned to Lucas. After the trip to the lookout point, everything felt even more complicated. His words, his gaze, every moment with him left an imprint I couldn't erase. I heard a light knock on the door. At first I froze, hoping it wouldn't come again, but then the door slowly opened. Lucas stepped inside, closing it behind him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Lucas, this is a bad idea," I replied, setting the book aside. "You shouldn't be here." "Margot." His eyes pierced through me, as always. "I can't just ignore this, and neither can you." He stepped closer, and the air in the room grew heavier. Every step he took felt slow, as if time had stretched. I wanted to stop him, to say something sharp, but the words caught in my throat. When he leaned down to kiss me again, I didn't move. His lips met mine, and the world around us disappeared. It was soft yet insistent, as if he was trying to prove something I was too afraid to admit. For a few seconds, I let myself forget who I was, what I was doing, and how wrong it all was. But then reality came rushing back. I pulled away, stepping back as if waking from a dream. "We can't," I exhaled, trying to steady the tremor in my voice. "This is wrong. Leave." Lucas held my gaze for a long moment, his face calm, but his eyes betrayed his pain. He said nothing, simply turned and walked to the door. That's when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart sank. Adam. He was home earlier than expected. The door opened, and Lucas stepped out of the room just as Adam entered the house. I heard their footsteps in the hallway. A moment later, I saw them meet. My husband and his brother locked eyes. Adam said nothing, but his face tightened. His gaze was heavy, piercing, but he didn't ask questions. I stayed in the bedroom, feeling waves of tension crash over me. That brief encounter in the hallway was loaded with meaning. I knew Adam might have noticed the look on my face or the tremble in my hands, but he said nothing. The night passed in silence. I lay in bed trying to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Adam lay beside me, his breathing even, but I knew he wasn't asleep. My heart pounded with the thought that he might have figured something out. Was that look just exhaustion? Or did he suspect something? Every second felt like an eternity. I could feel the chasm between us growing deeper, even though neither of us said a word. but the silence felt louder than any conversation could. The house had changed. Between Adam and me, once filled with warmth and trust, an invisible wall had formed. He avoided conversations, gave curt answers, and spent more time outside the house. His silence cut deeper than any words could, and the tension in the air was almost suffocating. I tried convincing myself that he was just tired, that it was temporary. But the nagging worry wouldn't leave. I knew something had shifted, and it had everything to do with Lucas. After that night, when Adam had seen him leaving my bedroom, everything had spiraled out of control. Every time I tried to talk to Adam, he found an excuse to leave. We no longer shared everyday moments, no discussions about the news, no laughing over silly jokes. The silence tore me apart. What hurt even more was knowing it was all my fault. Lucas remained calm, almost indifferent. He seemed oblivious to the fact that his presence was slowly tearing my world apart. At some point, I couldn't take it anymore. It happened one evening when he walked into the kitchen, where I was trying to collect my thoughts over a cup of cold tea. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" My voice trembled with anger, but I couldn't stop. "You're breaking everything I've built for years. You're destroying my life." Lucas stopped, giving me a long look, but he didn't seem surprised. "Margot, you're blaming the wrong person," he said calmly, though there was a certainty in his tone that only angered me more. "I'm not destroying your life. I'm showing you what you're really worth." "What I'm worth?" I let out a bitter laugh, disbelief seeping into my voice. "You think your meddling is helping me? You honestly believe you're making things better?" "Yes," he replied, his gaze steady. "You deserve more, Margot. You know that, but you're too afraid to admit it." I couldn't bear his confidence. My anger turned to desperation, and I fled the kitchen, leaving him standing there alone. In my room, I tried to collect my thoughts, but his words kept replaying in my head. Later that evening, Adam was sitting in the living room, his phone in hand. I walked in, planning to ask how his day had gone, hoping to bridge the growing distance between us. But he didn't even look up. "Is there something you forgot to explain?" His voice was quiet, but there was an icy edge to it that made me freeze. "What are you talking about?" I felt the blood drain from my face. He raised the phone, showing me the screen. It was my phone. On the screen was my text conversation with Lucas, the message where he apologized for the kiss. The world around me seemed to collapse. Adam wasn't waiting for an explanation. He already understood. His gaze held pain and disappointment I couldn't bear to see. Adam's words echoed in my mind, like voices bouncing off the walls of an empty room. He didn't look at me, but his expression said more than any accusation. I tried to gather my thoughts, to find the strength to explain, but it felt like the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. The morning began in silence. I stood at the kitchen counter, making coffee, avoiding his gaze. The scene from the night before, when he found the messages with Lucas, lingered like an open wound. Adam sat at the table, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of his cup. The silence was deafening. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, almost devoid of emotion, but each word cut deep. He accused me of pulling away, of no longer being the person I used to be. He said I was hiding something, that it was tearing us apart. I tried to convince him otherwise, blaming fatigue, work, and the 100 little things that had piled up. But my words sounded hollow, even to myself. Adam didn't ask further questions. He just stared at me, as if trying to extract answers from a place where none existed. His gaze was unbearable. Lucas's footsteps echoed in the hallway, breaking the oppressive quiet. My shoulders tensed as he entered the room. I didn't look at him, but his presence filled the space, as it always did. Adam noticed him and stood, his movements sharp but restrained. The air between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken tension. I knew a confrontation was brewing. The two brothers stood facing each other, their gazes speaking volumes. Lucas was calm, as always, but determination burned in his eyes. Adam, on the other hand, looked taut, his restrained indignation breaking through in a sharp gesture as he raised his hand, as if to say something, but stopped. This was the breaking point I had dreaded. My silence, my hesitation, and everything that had happened between Lucas and me had finally boiled over. I could feel their unspoken battle filling the room, threatening to destroy everything. Unable to take it any longer, I stood. The words spilled from my lips before I could process them. I begged Lucas to leave, explaining that his presence was tearing my marriage apart, my life apart. I pleaded with him to let us heal, to allow things to return to normal. But he didn't move. His face remained calm, but I could see my words had wounded him. Lucas held my gaze for a long time before quietly responding that he wouldn't leave. He said it softly, but his voice carried pain. He loved me, and he didn't hide it. Adam remained silent. His face had gone pale, his eyes darkened with emotions he was barely holding back. I knew that Lucas's words, his confession, had shattered whatever remained between us. The rupture was irreversible. When Lucas finally left the room, I felt my strength drain away. Adam looked at me, but his gaze was empty. It wasn't anger or hatred. It was indifference, and it stole away the last remnants of my world. I was alone in the living room, sorting through a pile of old magazines I'd meant to throw away for weeks. The evening dragged on slowly, and I couldn't seem to settle. I wore a short skirt and a light blouse, something comfortable, without giving much thought to how it might appear. Lucas appeared out of nowhere, as he often did. His steps were quiet, almost soundless, but his presence was always unmistakable. I felt his gaze as soon as he entered the room. "You're always taking everything on yourself," he remarked, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent that made me tense. "You don't have to do everything alone." "They're just magazines," I replied, trying to focus on my hands as they folded the papers. I could feel him standing too close, his shadow falling over me. Lucas leaned in to help, and that's when I noticed his hand resting on the edge of the table, almost brushing mine. It seemed like a casual gesture, but there was more behind it. When I turned to look at him, his gaze dropped lower, lingering on where my short skirt left too much exposed. "Lucas," I said, my voice trembling slightly. It was a warning, but instead of stopping, he moved closer. His hand grazed my thigh. I froze. "You know how I feel about you," he whispered. His touch became firmer, sliding upward along the fabric of my skirt. The world around me disappeared. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This was wrong, but my body felt paralyzed. When I finally looked up, I saw Adam standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his gaze sharp as a knife. For a moment, everything froze before the silence exploded. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, stepping into the room. His voice was loud, filled with anger. I jumped to my feet, trying to explain, but the words stuck in my throat. "Adam, it's not what you think," I started, but he wasn't looking at me. This whole time." His words were fragmented, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "With my brother?" "You're misunderstanding," Lucas interjected, his voice surprisingly calm, which only fueled Adam's rage. "Shut up!" Adam yelled, stepping closer to his brother. His fists clenched, and I could feel the situation spiraling out of control. I stood between them, trying to diffuse the tension, but every word I said only made things worse. Adam accused Lucas of betrayal, shouting that he had destroyed everything we had. Lucas, in contrast, remained composed, but his words were laced with pain. "You never saw how much she was hurting," he said quietly. "You never noticed she wasn't happy." Those words were the final straw. Adam shoved Lucas, but he didn't retaliate. I screamed, begging them to stop, but they didn't hear me. Lucas turned to me, his gaze long and full of sorrow. He stepped toward the door without looking back. "I'll go," he said before walking out. His voice was firm, but it carried undeniable pain. When the door slammed shut, the silence in the house was deafening. Adam stood in the middle of the room, unmoving. His eyes, filled with disappointment and hurt, were fixed on me. I knew it was over. A chasm had opened between us, one that could never be crossed. The house felt foreign. Every room reminded me of the events of the past days, like wounds that refused to heal. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on me with every passing moment. Adam had packed his things and left. His last words were dry, filled with pain and resentment. I can't live like this anymore. Now I was surrounded by emptiness so vast it felt like it would consume me. The remnants of Adam's presence, forgotten shirts, his books on the shelf, seemed like accusations. But the heaviest weight was Lucas's absence. He was gone, and despite the storm he'd brought into my life, his disappearance left me in even deeper isolation. I didn't know what to do. All day I tried to focus on household chores, hoping work would distract me. But my thoughts inevitably circled back to Lucas. Why had he left so suddenly? Why hadn't he tried to explain? Each hour without an answer fanned the flames of my anxiety and despair. I dialed his number. The phone rang, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, I sent him a message. "Please call me. We need to talk." Time dragged on unbearably slowly. No reply came. Over and over, I stared at my phone screen, waiting for any sign. I tried to rationalize his silence. Maybe he needed time to sort himself out. But the silence was killing me. I called him again, but his phone was off. The next morning I tried again. Messages, calls, everything went unanswered. Each passing hour of silence made my attempts feel increasingly futile. Lucas had disappeared. His motives were unclear. He had told me he loved me, said it plainly. But why now did he seem to vanish from my life? The days blurred together. I found myself sitting in the empty living room, staring blankly out the window. Everything I had done, everything that had happened had brought me to this point, this state of complete loneliness. Adam wasn't coming back. Lucas seemed to be gone for good, and I was left alone with thoughts that tore me apart from within. At some point, I realized I couldn't keep fighting. I picked up my phone and dialed Lucas's number one last time. This time, the call didn't even go through. He had disconnected entirely. It was the final blow. He was gone, and he didn't want me to be part of his life. I stared at the phone in my hand, feeling tears slowly slide down my cheeks. There was no sobbing, just a quiet stream, a reflection of the emptiness inside me. I knew I had lost everything. And now, there was nothing left but to accept it.